Hey everyone, I'm Dr. Eleanor Grant. Throughout human history, we see a recurring and often tragic pattern. It's the story of what happens when religious authority and government power become intertwined. From ancient empires to modern nations, this fusion has consistently paved the way for profound abuses, systemic oppression, and staggering violence. When the institutions that guide our spiritual lives also wield the sword of the state, the lines between moral guidance and coercive control blur, often with devastating consequences for ordinary people. It's a pattern that transcends any single religion or culture, a kind of historical constant that we really need to understand. So, why is this union so consistently lethal? What is it about merging the pulpit and the parliament, the temple and the throne, that seems to poison both? It's not just a matter of bad actors or a few unfortunate historical moments. There are fundamental structural reasons why this combination is so dangerous. It transforms faith from a personal conviction into a political tool. It turns sacred texts into legal codes, and it weaponizes belief against those who dare to think differently. This isn't just an abstract political science debate. It's a question that has shaped empires, fueled wars, and determined the fate of millions. In this video, we're going to dive deep into this complex relationship. We'll journey through history, examining key moments where church and state became one, and we'll unpack the consequences. We'll look at why this merger corrupts the very institutions it claims to empower, and how it ultimately harms both the government and the faith it professes to protect. My goal is to clearly explain why this union is so often a recipe for disaster, and why keeping them separate is one of the most important safeguards for a free and just society. Let's get started. So, let's start with a foundational principle famously articulated by Lord Acton. Power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. This isn't just a clever political slogan, it's a profound observation about human nature. When any single entity, be it a king, a committee, or a church, accumulates unchecked power, the potential for abuse skyrockets. This dynamic becomes especially volatile when the power in question is not just political but also spiritual. The state holds power over your body and your property, but when it merges with a church, it claims authority over your soul, your conscience, and your eternal destiny. This creates a terrifying form of absolute power. A purely secular government might punish you for breaking a law, but a theocracy can punish you for thinking the wrong thoughts or holding the wrong beliefs. It erases the distinction between a crime, which is an act against the state, and a sin, which is an act against God. Suddenly, heresy, a theological disagreement, becomes treason, a crime punishable by the state. This is the mechanism that turns faith, something that should be a source of comfort and moral guidance, into a brutal weapon of social and political control. Consider the Spanish Inquisition, one of history's most infamous examples of this principle in action. Established in the late 15th century by Catholic monarchs Ferdinand and Isabella, it was a state-controlled institution with a religious mandate to enforce Catholic orthodoxy. Its primary targets were conversos, Jews and Muslims who had converted to Christianity but were suspected of secretly practicing their old faiths. The Inquisition had the full backing of the Spanish crown, giving it the power to investigate, arrest, imprison, and interrogate anyone. The methods employed were, of course, horrific. The goal was to extract a confession, and torture was a standard, legally sanctioned tool of interrogation. Devices like the strappado, where victims were hung by their wrists, or the water cure, which simulated drowning, were systematically used to break the will of the accused. Remember, these weren't rogue agents. This was the official policy of a state-sanctioned religious body. The state provided the muscle, the prisons, and the executioners, while the church provided the justification. It was a perfect, horrifying symbiosis of power. The public spectacle of the auto da fe, or act of faith, was the culmination of this process. Here, the condemned were paraded through the streets and their sentences were read aloud. Those who repented were often strangled before being burned at the stake. The unrepentant were burned alive. This wasn't just about punishment, it was about theatrical terror. It was a message from the unified church state to the entire population. We control what you do, what you say, and what you believe. Step out of line and this will be your fate. The Inquisition wasn't just a frenzy of religious zealots. It was a calculated political instrument. The crown used it to eliminate political rivals, confiscate the wealth of the condemned, and forge a unified Spanish identity built on a foundation of absolute religious conformity. It demonstrates with chilling clarity how merging church and state creates a system where dissent is impossible, where conscience is criminalized, and where the state can justify unspeakable cruelty in the name of God. It's a system designed not to save souls, but to control them. This wasn't a one-off event. We see similar dynamics in John Calvin's Geneva, where the consistory, a body of pastors and elders, had the power to enforce religious and moral law. They policed everything from church attendance to tavern gambling. While perhaps not as bloody as the Spanish Inquisition, the principle was the same. The state was empowered to enforce a specific theological viewpoint, and dissenters like Michael Servetus, who disagreed on the doctrine of the Trinity, were executed for heresy. The core lesson here is that when a religious institution gains access to the state's monopoly on violence, it inevitably uses it. The mission shifts from persuasion to coercion. The tools of evangelism are replaced with the tools of law enforcement. The church stops being a community of believers and becomes an arm of the state police, monitoring the inner lives of its citizens. The promise of heaven becomes a threat used to maintain earthly power. It's a tragic irony. An institution founded on principles of love, grace, and forgiveness becomes an agent of torture, terror, and death. This happens because the very nature of state power is coercive. It relies on force or the threat of force to maintain order. When the church embraces that power, it must by necessity adopt its methods. It must be willing to fine, to imprison, and ultimately to kill in order to enforce its will. And so, the corruption is total. The state is corrupted because it is now meddling in matters of conscience that are beyond its rightful domain. And the church is corrupted because it has abandoned its moral authority, which rests on voluntary belief, in favor of political power, which rests on force. It trades its prophetic voice for a seat at the table of power, and in doing so becomes just another worldly kingdom, indistinguishable from the oppressive systems it was meant to critique. When a single religious viewpoint becomes fused with the identity of the state, a dangerous us versus them mentality is almost always the result. The state religion becomes the definition of what it means to be a loyal citizen. To belong to the nation, you must belong to its church. This creates an environment where religious minorities are not just seen as theologically incorrect, but as politically suspect, disloyal, and a threat to the stability and identity of the entire nation. They are outsiders within their own homeland. This dynamic transforms religious disagreement into a national security issue. Adherence to the state church is patriotism. Dissent is sedition. This provides the perfect justification for persecution. The state, in its quest for unity and security, can target minority faiths with the full force of law. They can be stripped of their rights, have their property confiscated, be driven into exile, or, in the most extreme cases, be systematically eliminated. The state provides the power, and the official church provides the moral and theological pretext. A stark and tragic example of this is the reign of Queen Mary I of England in the mid-16th century. Mary was a devout Catholic, and she came to the throne after the short reign of her Protestant half-brother, Edward VI. Her primary goal was to reverse the English Reformation and return England to the Catholic fold. For Mary, religious unity was national unity. To be English was to be Catholic, and the presence of Protestants was a cancer on the body politic that had to be excised. To achieve this, Mary and her government revived the Heresy Acts, laws that made it a capital crime to hold Protestant beliefs. This wasn't a matter of private conscience. If you denied key Catholic doctrines like transubstantiation, you were an enemy of both God and the Crown. Special commissions were established to hunt down these heretics. Neighbors were encouraged to inform on neighbors, creating a climate of fear and suspicion that tore communities apart. It was a state-sponsored witch hunt where the witches were people of faith whose conscience led them to a different understanding of the gospel. The result was a brutal campaign of persecution that earned her the infamous nickname Bloody Mary. Over a period of less than 4 years, nearly 300 Protestants were burned at the stake. These weren't quiet executions. They were public spectacles designed to terrify the population into submission. Victims included prominent church leaders like Archbishop Thomas Cranmer, but also common labourers, artisans and women. Their crime was not treason in a political sense, but a refusal to conform to the state-mandated religion. This highlights the core problem. When the state picks a religious winner, everyone else loses. The state cannot be an impartial arbiter when its very identity is tied to one faith. It becomes the enforcer for that faith, and all other beliefs are delegitimized. This wasn't unique to Catholic England. After Mary's death, her Protestant half-sister Elizabeth I took the throne. While more pragmatic, her government also enforced religious conformity, persecuting and sometimes executing Catholics who were seen as loyal to a foreign power, the Pope, and therefore a threat to the English crown. The pattern repeats itself across Europe. In France, the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre of 1572 saw thousands of French Protestants, known as Huguenots, slaughtered by Catholic mobs with the implicit approval of the royal court. For centuries, Jewish communities across Europe were subjected to pogroms, expulsions and violence, often fueled by the false accusation that they were Christ killers, a theological charge used to justify political and economic persecution by Christian states. The logic is inescapable. If the state declares one path to God to be the only true path, then those on other paths are, by definition, enemies of the state's truth. The government's duty is no longer to protect the freedom of all its citizens to believe as they see fit, but to protect the true religion from the perceived corruption of other faiths. This creates a permanent, legally enshrined class of second-class citizens whose rights, property, and even lives are perpetually at risk. This persecution is not an anomaly or an unfortunate byproduct of the church-state union. It is its logical and almost inevitable consequence. To create a state religion is to build a wall of orthodoxy. Those inside the wall are safe, protected, and true citizens. Those outside the wall are dangerous, suspect, and ultimately expendable. The state uses its power to police this wall, and in doing so it betrays its most fundamental duty, to protect all of its people, not just the ones who pray the right way. Ultimately, this system damages the very faith it claims to protect. A faith that relies on the sword of the state to enforce its beliefs is a faith that has lost confidence in the power of its own truth. It shows that it cannot win hearts and minds through persuasion, love, and reason, so it must resort to coercion, fear, and violence. It creates a nation not of genuine believers, but of terrified conformists, and it stains the name of religion with the blood of the innocent. When a church aligns itself with the power of the state, it makes a terrible bargain. It might gain influence, prestige, and protection, but it almost always loses its soul. The church's primary role, its prophetic voice, is to stand apart from worldly power structures and speak truth to them. It is meant to be the conscience of a nation, calling it to justice, mercy, and righteousness. It should be the institution that reminds kings and presidents that they are not God and that their authority is limited. But when the church becomes part of that power structure, it can no longer critique it effectively. I mean, how can you speak truth to power when you are sitting at the same table, enjoying the same privileges? The church's leaders become courtiers, political players whose primary goal shifts from spiritual guidance to maintaining their position and influence within the government. Their allegiance becomes divided, torn between the kingdom of God and the political agenda of the state. Inevitably, the state's agenda wins. This politicization fundamentally corrupts the church's witness. It begins to view the world through a political lens. The gospel message of love, redemption, and care for the poor gets twisted to support partisan goals. Sermons can start to sound like campaign speeches. The church's resources, its buildings, its publications, its people, are mobilized not for spiritual ends, but for political ones, to get a certain candidate elected. to pass a particular law, or to support a nationalistic cause. The church becomes a chaplain to the state, blessing its actions rather than challenging them. Perhaps no historical example illustrates this corruption more terrifyingly than the experience of the church in Nazi Germany. When Adolf Hitler rose to power in 1933, the majority of Germany's churches, both Protestant and Catholic, did not stand in prophetic opposition. Instead, many sought to align themselves with the new regime. They were seduced by Hitler's promises to restore national pride, combat godless communism, and promote positive Christianity. They saw him as an ally, a defender of traditional values against the perceived decadence of the Weimar Republic. A significant portion of the Protestant Church actively embraced this alignment, forming a movement known as the German Christians. This group sought to fuse Christianity with Nazi ideology. They adopted the swastika, promoted Hitler as a figure sent by God, and worked to purge the church of all Jewish influences, including the Old Testament. They argued that to be a good German was to be a good Nazi, and to be a good Christian was to support the Führer. This was the ultimate politicization. The cross was literally draped in the swastika. This alignment had devastating consequences. By lending their moral and spiritual authority to the Nazi regime, these church leaders provided a veneer of legitimacy for its horrific actions. They stood by and in many cases actively supported the stripping of rights from Jewish citizens, the persecution of political dissidents, and the build-up of a totalitarian state. Their prophetic voice was not just silenced, it was co-opted. They became cheerleaders for a demonic ideology, baptizing nationalism and racism with holy water. Of course, there was resistance. A brave minority formed the Confessing Church, led by figures like Dietrich Bonhoeffer and Martin Niemöller. They declared that their ultimate allegiance was to Jesus Christ, not to Adolf Hitler. They rejected the state's attempt to control the church and spoke out against the regime's idolatry and injustice. But they were a minority, and they paid a heavy price. Many were arrested, imprisoned, and executed. Their story is a testament to the courage of true faith, but it also underscores the immense pressure to conform when the church and state are intertwined. The Catholic Church's record was also tragically compromised. It signed the Reichskonkordat, a treaty with the Nazi regime in 1933. The Vatican hoped this would protect the church's rights in Germany, but in practice, it lent international prestige to Hitler's government and largely silenced Catholic criticism of the regime in its crucial early years. While some individual priests and bishops were courageous, the institution as a whole chose diplomatic caution over prophetic confrontation, a choice that haunts its legacy to this day. The lesson from Nazi Germany is stark and absolute. When the church aligns itself with a political agenda, especially a nationalistic one, it risks becoming an accomplice to evil. It trades its birthright, its moral authority and prophetic independence for a bowl of political pottage. It stops serving God and starts serving the state, or worse, the ruling party. Its saltiness is lost, and it becomes good for nothing but to be thrown out and trampled underfoot. This is not just a historical problem. Whenever you see a church wrap itself in a national flag, claiming that God is on one side of a political aisle, the same dangerous process is at work. It's a betrayal of the gospel, which is for all people in all nations under all political systems. The church is at its best and most faithful when it maintains its distinct identity, serving as a moral compass for the nation, not as a political tool within it. There is a fundamental paradox at the heart of every state religion. Faith, by its very nature, cannot be compelled. True belief is a matter of the heart, a personal conviction, a voluntary response of the conscience to what it perceives as true. You can force someone to bow, to recite a creed, to attend a church service, but you cannot force them to actually believe. The moment you use coercion to produce a religious outcome, you are no longer cultivating faith, you are manufacturing hypocrisy. When a state mandates religious observance, it fundamentally changes the nature of that observance. Attending church is no longer an act of worship, It's an act of civic duty, like paying taxes or serving on a jury. Saying the right prayers becomes a way to stay out of trouble with the authorities. Baptism isn't a symbol of inner transformation. It's a required rite of passage to be a full citizen, to get a job, or to get married. The entire system is built on external compliance rather than internal conviction. This leads to a phenomenon that sociologists call dead formalism. The pews may be full, the rituals may be perfectly performed, and the church's coffers may be overflowing with state funds, but the spiritual vitality is gone. The religion becomes a hollow shell, a cultural tradition devoid of genuine faith. People go through the motions, saying the words and performing the actions, but their hearts are not in it. It's a mile wide and an inch deep, a religion of appearance, not of substance. We can see this clearly in the history of many state churches in Europe. For centuries, in countries like Sweden, Denmark, England, or parts of Germany, the Lutheran or Anglican Church was an arm of the government. Citizenship and church membership were virtually synonymous. Infant baptism was universal and mandatory. Confirmation was a social expectation. To not participate was to be a social outcast, or worse, to run afoul of the law. What was the long-term result of this? Did it create nations of deeply committed Christians? The evidence suggests the opposite. As soon as societal and legal pressures were relaxed, church attendance plummeted. Today, many of these magnificent historic state-funded cathedrals stand largely empty on Sundays. A tiny fraction of the population actively participates in the life of the church, to which on paper most of them still belong. The religion has become a cultural artifact, a part of the national heritage, like a folk dance or a traditional dish, rather than a living, breathing faith. This emptiness breeds cynicism and resentment. People come to associate Christianity not with grace and liberation, but with boredom, obligation, and social pressure. For many, the church is just another bureaucratic state institution, the place you have to go for baptisms, weddings, and funerals. This damages the gospel's reputation for generations. It creates a massive barrier for anyone seeking a genuine spiritual experience, because the official version of faith presented by the state is so obviously lifeless and uninspiring. Moreover, a system of compelled religion stifles spiritual innovation and dissent. In a free marketplace of ideas, different religious expressions can compete, learn from each other, and challenge one another to be more authentic. But in a state church monopoly, there is only one approved provider. Dissenting movements, which are often the source of spiritual renewal, are suppressed. The church becomes stagnant, resistant to change, and unable to adapt to the spiritual questions and needs of new generations. The 18th century revival movements, like Methodism in England or Pietism in Germany, were born in reaction to this very dead formalism. John Wesley didn't set out to start a new denomination. He wanted to revive the spiritually moribund Church of England from within. He preached in open fields because the official churches often closed their doors to his passionate, heartfelt message. These movements were powerful precisely because they were voluntary, appealing to the conscience and the emotions, not to civic duty. Ultimately, compelled religion is a profound vote of no confidence in the power of the faith itself. It operates on the assumption that the Christian message is not attractive or persuasive enough to win people over on its own merits, so it needs the state's help to prop it up. It's a confession of weakness. True faith thrives in an environment of freedom, where it must be authentic, relevant, and compelling to survive and grow. Forcing religion on people doesn't save their souls, it inoculates them against the real thing. It gives them just enough religion to make them think they don't need a genuine encounter with God. It's a system that, in its attempt to guarantee the church's survival, ends up producing a generation of people who are, in the famous words of C.S. Lewis, dull, complacent, and listless in their faith, if they have any at all. To truly understand the Christian perspective on the separation of church and state, we have to go to the source, Jesus himself. If anyone in history had the right to establish a kingdom on earth, to merge divine authority with political power, it was him, and yet, at every opportunity, he explicitly rejected this path. His life and teachings provide the most powerful argument against the fusion of faith and government. Think about the context of his ministry. He lived and taught in a land, Judea, that was occupied by the brutal military power of the Roman Empire. Many of his fellow Jews were longing for a Messiah who would be a political and military leader. They hoped for a new King David who would raise an army, drive out the Romans, and restore a sovereign theocratic kingdom of Israel. This was the dominant political and religious expectation of the time. The Gospels show us that Jesus was constantly being tempted with this version of messiahship. Early in his ministry, in the wilderness, the devil offers him all the kingdoms of the world and their glory if he would just bow down and worship him. It's a temptation to achieve his ends through the world's means, power, wealth, and political control. Jesus unequivocally rejects it, quoting scripture, "You shall worship the Lord your God, and him only shall you serve." This theme continues throughout his public life. After he miraculously feeds a crowd of 5,000 people, the Gospel of John tells us the people were ecstatic. They recognized his power and were ready to make him their political leader by force. John chapter 6, verse 15 is incredibly revealing. Perceiving then that they were about to come and take him by force to make him king, Jesus withdrew again to the mountain by himself. He runs away from the crown. He refuses the path of political revolution. His mission was not to overthrow Caesar, but to establish a different kind of kingdom altogether. When he stands on trial for his life before the Roman governor Pontius Pilate, he gives the clearest possible statement on the nature of his authority. Pilate asks him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus answers, "My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would have been fighting that I might not be delivered over to the Jews. But my kingdom is not from the world." This is a radical political statement. Jesus declares that his kingdom operates on a completely different plane from the kingdoms of this world, which are built on power, violence, and coercion. My servants would have been fighting. His kingdom is not a geopolitical entity. It doesn't have borders, an army, or a tax code. It is a spiritual reality that advances not by the sword, but by love, service, sacrifice, and the transformation of the human heart. He reinforces this distinction with his famous teaching about taxes. When questioned about loyalty to the Roman state, he holds up a coin and asks whose image is on it. "Caesar's," they reply. "Then render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's," Jesus says, "and to God the things that are God's." This is a brilliant and foundational statement for the separation of spheres. He acknowledges that the state has legitimate but limited authority in its own domain. But there is another domain, the domain of God, that is separate and ultimate. The mission Jesus gave to his followers was not to seize the levers of government. He never told them to lobby the Roman Senate, to run for office, or to form a political party. He told them to go and make disciples, to love your neighbor, to care for the poor, to be salt and light in the world. The church's power was to be a moral and spiritual one, the power of witness, service, and sacrificial love. It was to influence society from the bottom up by changing hearts and minds, not from the top down by seizing power. When later Christians, centuries after Jesus, decided to merge the church with the Roman Empire under Emperor Constantine, they were fundamentally reversing the decision Jesus himself had made. They accepted the offer of worldly power that Jesus had rejected in the wilderness. They chose to build a kingdom of this world, using the world's tools of power and coercion. And as we've seen throughout this video, the results have often been disastrous, leading to corruption, persecution, and a betrayal of the very nature of Jesus' mission. The example of Jesus provides a permanent, powerful critique of any attempt to create a Christian nation through political force. It suggests that the church is most faithful to its founder not when it is ruling from a palace, but when it is serving the marginalized. Not when it is passing laws, but when it is washing feet. Not when it is aligned with the powerful, but when it is speaking truth to them. Jesus' rejection of political power is the ultimate argument for a church that is a witness, not a ruler. So, as we've journeyed through these dark chapters of history, a clear and sobering conclusion emerges. When the church binds itself to the mechanisms of government, it embarks on a path of self-destruction. It trades its divine calling for earthly power, and in the process loses the very things that make it vital. It loses its prophetic voice, becoming a chaplain to the state rather than its conscience. It becomes entangled in political corruption, prioritizing influence over integrity. It inevitably turns to persecuting those who believe differently, staining its hands with the blood of the very people it is called to love. Ultimately, this unholy alliance inflicts profound damage on the credibility and witness of the gospel itself. The historical record is unambiguous. True faith cannot be forced. It thrives not under the shadow of the sword, but in the sunlight of freedom. The church is at its most authentic, its most vibrant, and its most Christ-like when it operates as a voluntary community of believers, persuading others through love, reason, and the compelling beauty of its message. It is healthiest not as a ruler, dictating laws from a throne, but as a witness, living out its convictions in the public square. Its power should be the moral power of its example, not the coercive power of the state. This is why the separation of church and state is not an anti-religious idea. It is, in fact, the greatest protector of authentic faith. It allows the church to be the church and the state to be the state. It frees the government to protect the rights of all citizens, regardless of their beliefs, and it frees the church to pursue its spiritual mission without the corrupting temptations of political power. For the sake of both a just government and a faithful church, we must insist that the wall separating them remains high and strong. True faith doesn't need the government's help. It only needs the freedom to be itself.